John 13, 1 through 17. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them."
All right, good morning again. So technically today is also the last Sunday in Lent, which means it's the last Sunday for our 7 deadly sins, wrapping this up today. Some of you have been keeping track and are faithful disciples of your 7 deadly sins are wondering, when are we going to cover envy? Good point. Unfortunately, Lent only gives us 6 Sundays, so one of them had to go. One of them we felt I could kind of mix in with the other ones, and so envy took the hit. Apologies to all of you who uniquely struggle with envy. Maybe we'll come back to it in the summer or something when we have some time. Yeah, we're wrapping up our series here that we've been doing during Lent on the 7 deadly sins. Again, with the intent of honoring what the intent of the season is, to let it be a time of renewal where the Spirit comes and we open ourselves up just a little bit more than maybe we do throughout the rest of the year to the Spirit's refining work in our lives, unearthing things that still maybe are not quite right, unholy allegiances in our heart and things so that we might be conformed more and more into the image of Christ. And each week I've always felt led to just like give a couple, not caveats, but just a couple disclaimers or just a couple things to remember about these 7 deadly sins before we dive in and look at one of them. And, so before we just jump into this last one, I'm reminded of 2 things in particular here this morning. Well, I'll say this. Essentially, I'm hoping that today necessarily isn't the end of the conversation about these deadly sins and the effects that they have on our lives and on our relationships. If anything, I'm hoping that, that just has stirred a few things that we'll continue to talk about. Or maybe what I'm interested in, I'm very mindful that, it's not like we just talk about a sin that, a particular deadly sin, one that we struggle with, and then just say, stop doing that. And then, okay, I guess I won't do that anymore. It's not that simple. I think it was my dad who always would tell me that's his approach to pastoral counseling. My dad was a pastor as well, too, and he always said, that was my approach to pastoral counseling. I think he said everything he learned about pastoral counseling, he learned from Bob Newhart, who apparently was a psychologist on, I don't know, Mary Tyler Moore show or some show, and his whole strategy was whenever couples would come into his office and explain their problems, he would just say, just stop it. And my dad said, well, that's my approach to counseling. People come in and say, stop it. And I don't know if it's, the next generation comes along, well, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's not so easy to just stop it. Or it's maybe easier for some than it is for others, right? It's those who have suffered more severe forms of injustice than others of us. They might struggle a little bit more to let go of anger and rage than others. Or those who wrestle with mental struggles of anxiety and depression. Sloth may be a little bit more challenging for them than for others, right? Which is all to say that, my intent as pastor is not just to unload these sins and say, stop it, and then off you go, but it's to say, hey, these things have deadly effect in our lives and our relationships, and let's constantly be at the work together of rooting these things out, right? So if there's ever any way that any of us pastors here can be of support and encouragement and prayer to you as you're trying to weed these things out in life, man, we'd be happy to. Or I think your grace groups would love to continue to be places where we talk about these things and hold each other accountable to it and ask questions, how are we doing? In other words, don't stop the conversation here. Let's keep it going. The other thing that I'm reminded of as we jump into this came from a conversation, actually I was having with my brother-in-law a little bit this week. Just reminded that, what we classify as deadly sins depends largely upon the life view that we live out of. Or I could say it this way, right? If the greatest aim, or maybe I say it this way, it depends on what your definition of the good life is, right? If your definition of the good life is the American dream and having full freedom to live life in pursuit of your individual goals and dreams that you set for your life, okay, then these kind of sins probably aren't going to feel quite so deadly. Or even if you have a Christianized version of that rugged individualistic experience, and you approach Christianity as just or only this personal, private relationship that I have between me and Jesus, right? Then these sins may not seem quite so deadly to you. But if for you the good life is the kingdom of Christ and the mission of the King, right? If you genuinely believe that, yeah, that is the good life, that is the rich life, that is the glory-filled life, then you see how, or we've tried to bring it out, how each of these sins is uniquely deadly to that life. Because each of these sins, in a way, are pulling us away from love and service and relationships, right? The very things that Jesus is constantly calling us into for the sake of the kingdom. All right, and that's maybe the one thing that I want you to keep in mind as we talk about this last sin that we're getting at here this morning. We'll circle back around to that, but just keep that on the forefront of your mind. Just this idea that what makes a sin deadly is ultimately based on what you consider the good and the glorious life. And if it's the kingdom, yeah, that's where these sins are particularly deadly, in our enjoyment of the kingdom and our living out of the mission of the King. So, what's this last sin we're going to look at today? It's the sin of vainglory. Well, I'd love to pause and ask for a definition of vainglory that's out there. You might be saying, yeah, well, what's vainglory? Is that pride? Is that essentially what vainglory is? And I would say, well, it's close. Maybe I've heard some of I've read some of the spiritual writers who would talk about vainglory as being the mother of pride in a way, but it's very, very different. And maybe to get at this, the difference between pride and vainglory, I'll tell you this, it was actually the Sunday before Lent, when we were jumping into these 7 deadly sins, I actually preached a little bit about pride as sort of like the root sin behind all of these. And in that sermon, I think I said at one point how, one of the ways that we combat pride in our own lives is that we come and counter with something that's of far greater glory than ourselves. And I think I gave the illustration of like when you're hiking out in the hills or in the mountains or the woods and you turn a corner and you see this epic scene in front of you, like you just get lost in the grandeur and the glory of it. And probably in that moment, the thing that you're not thinking about is yourself and your own pride and glory. And there's like this spiritual implication of that. That's a great way to combat pride, is just to be overwhelmed by the glory of another. I went on to say in that sermon that, there's this unique thing that's happening out there, especially in the younger generations, where we're kind of collapsing even the grandeur of nature in on the self, so that if you're hiking in a national park and you come around a corner and you see this glorious scene, what you might also see is some millennial or Gen Zer who's standing there like this with a camera taking a selfie, and reducing the grandeur to what, that was the illustration. So then, don't you know, it was later that week, I started getting texts from a grace group that decided to meet in my office that week because the home that they meet in wasn't available or whatever. And I got a couple pictures. Well, first of all, I got a picture that week, after that Sunday, Callie and I left to go on a kind of a college road trip, and so we sort of headed west. And I got a picture from one of the members of this grace group, which was a picture, don't you know, of me holding a camera like this with my daughter Callie on the banks of Lake Michigan, because we were visiting Calvin College in Grand Rapids. And the person said, "So whose glory is this for?" I didn't even know how they got the picture. I had literally just taken the picture a couple hours earlier. I took the picture because I wanted to rub it into Amy that she's at home stuck with all the kids or whatever, while Callie and I are standing on the shore of Lake Michigan looking at this ocean. Apparently, Callie had posted it on Instagram, I don't know, just to show, oh, look, me and my daddy are out on a nice trip. So this individual had got it and said, whose glory is this for? And then I got a couple other pictures because they were meeting in my office. They saw that on my wall I have a picture of the back of Amy and I as we're sitting and we're staring at this, sort of epic slot canyon in Utah, and with the similar phrase, "Whose glory is this for?" Sorry, I'm not trying to make eye contact with anyone, but in particular. Now. But if I wanted to be if I wanted to push back on that grace group, I might say, okay, touche, but actually you've got your sins mixed up. See, it's the sin of pride, maybe, that has to stand there and take selfies in front of these glorious scenes and think of yourselves, well, this thing is not truly glory until I have a picture of me in it, right? That would be pride. Vainglory, then, is the sin of taking those things and posting it for the world to see so that they can be enamored with you and be full of admiration and respect for you. That's vainglory. You see the difference between vainglory and pride? Pride, in other words, is thinking you're all that in your own eyes. Vainglory is wanting to be all that in the eyes of the other. Right? Vainglory is having this, well, perhaps unhealthy or inordinate love and desire or coveting for the admiration, the respect, the love, the approval of others, right? It's constantly playing to the audience that is always out there, the court of public opinions, which we're always trying to navigate. And it is playing to that because you are in love with their respect, their admiration. Right? And again, sure, certainly social media is full of this, right? That's what you do on social media. You never post the embarrassing pictures of yourself on social media. Well, if I wanted to keep picking on Callie this morning, because she's not here, she's over in Italy with the school choir. Second time she's been to Italy. I've never been to Italy once, but she's over in Italy in the school choir, and I woke up this morning and checked the Instagram, and sure enough, she posted some pictures, in the streets of Sicily or the nice mountainside and all those things. Because that's what you do. What she did not post was a picture of the toilet that apparently her and her roommates broke a couple nights before, right? But you don't post the embarrassing things or the silly stuff, so you can be sure to ask her that when she comes back. Save her from vainglory. That's what you do on social media. So, right, so you see vainglory all over on social media. In fact, there's some interesting studies that have been done out there about how social media seems to be increasing tendencies of narcissistic personality disorder among people, because we're constantly, right, it's feeding this need for recognition and likes and all that, right? Actually, there's some studies done to show the correlation of the number of Facebook friends you have and the likelihood of having some certain personality, narcissistic personality disorders. And those with more and more Facebook friends, right? Those who are constantly trying to have more friends and more likes, whatever. Yeah, so social media seems to feed into this. But it's not just social media. Vainglory shows up in the person who's constantly hijacking conversations with personal stories and anecdotes. You know, the conversation gets on a certain topic. Oh, well, when I was in college, I did this, and whatever. Or let me tell you how I handled a very similar situation. Right? Or vainglory shows up in the people who are, constantly concerned to keep up appearances, and the things that they wear, the activities that they engage in, the people that they hang around with. Might maybe think of a young person in high school, and I'm concerned what I wear, who I associate with, the activities that I engage in, so that I can keep up my high standing in these social circles. Right? And if we kept going, there's the more deadly, more sinful side of vainglory as well too. Maybe you think of the wife who clearly has a spiritual gift of hospitality and mercy and care, and yet won't exercise hospitality because the house is constantly in disarray and disorder and chaos, and it's a mess. And we don't dare let people come in and see our mess and disorder. We always present the case that we've got things under control and it's calm and beautiful in our house, right? Or maybe in a more sinful way, it shows up in the workplace, and somebody, everybody at work is there, and they're engaging in the age-old tradition of slandering another coworker behind their back when they're not there, and propping themselves up by tearing down another. And you're standing there faced with now two loves. Do I love my neighbor? Do I love Christ who calls me to love my neighbor? Or do I love the standing that I have in front of these other coworkers, and I don't want them to think of me as some self-righteous prude, so sure, I'll join in and say, yeah, did you see what they did last week? Right? Or again, if you go back to the scenario of a young person in a school setting, right? Vainglory might, in a deadly way, have us to stay away from, or avoid relationships, or avoid people who maybe are not so good for our social standing, right? We're a little more selective in how we pick our friends based on the standing that will give to us. Or, someone, just desperately, could benefit so greatly from just hearing the loving truth of the gospel of Christ, and yet I'm going to hold back because I don't want them to think of me as some religious fanatic or something along those lines. Or there's spiritual vainglory. I think this is why Jesus would say to his disciples, hey, when you fast, don't go around fasting with your twisted face and oh man, woe is me. I'm choosing to fast for the glory of the Lord, and you see the clear pain that I'm enduring. Right? No, go privately in your own place, for your reward is in heaven. Another really deadly way that vainglory could show up, we choose not to be open and transparent with one another in the church. We don't let people see, the yet lingering broken side of us, the struggles that we have, the sins, the temptations that we fall prey to, right? And in so doing, we miss out on the grace that comes from Spirit-filled brothers and sisters around you, right? We miss out on what James says, confess your sins to one another so you may be healed. Or confess your sins to one another so that I may receive the encouragement, the prayer, the accountability, the love, and the support of my brothers and sisters. But no, if I'm concerned about maintaining appearances and not letting people see the broken and the chaotic and the wild side, I miss out. Maybe just two other quick unfortunate things about vainglory. Actually, a lot of the spiritual writers will talk, and this is what makes vainglory, in that we'll often, well, to put it in the vernacular, we'll sell out for the approval of the crowds, right? Or we'll sink to shallow depths to just gain more approval. Like I think of this, in the music world. I happen to be a fan of more independent artists or jazz musicians, right? Because they're probably not in it for the fame and glory because there's not a whole lot coming their way. And so, they just pursue excellence in music for the excellence of the craft, right? That's pride, in a good or bad. That's pride. Pride says, I don't care what everybody thinks. I'm just going to go after the excellence of the craft of music. Vainglory sells out and goes mainstream. Vainglory gets a producer and says, well, here's excellent music. That's fine, but nobody's going to resonate that. You want the crowd's approval. You want to be able to go on tour. You want to make lots of money. You got to dumb down some of that excellence there. Or again, it's the young person at school who, I don't know, might choose to dress more artistically or dress in more comfortable ways. But again, because they got to keep up appearances, you're going to dress in the things that are fashionably appropriate. Or maybe it's like the pastor, right, who's going to get up and who knows that this text, if you preach it correctly, is going to drive to a place of real discomfort and real, I don't know, whatever it is. But because he wants to be well-liked and well-received, well, we'll just shy away from that or we'll just jump to the next verse. I told Joe Worrell this week, maybe I should just preach a lousy sermon so that I people wouldn't come up and say, oh, it's a good sermon. I would be tempted to think vainglory. Joe said, wasn't that last week and the week before? No, he didn't say that. That was not Joe. But, actually that's missing, or that this is getting to this next point, this last dangerous point. No, you don't want to do that. Because here's the thing. The other thing about vainglory is that it takes these wonderful gifts and skills and abilities and talents or whatever that God gives to us on loan. Right? These gifts that the Spirit pours into us to say, hey, I'm giving you these gifts to steward for the advancement of my kingdom. And somehow we take these gifts and we twist and distort them to just promote our own glory, right? Instead of the glory of the giver. Right? Spiritual writers would say that's the real devilishness of vainglory, is that we take the gifts that we've been given to steward for the glory of the kingdom, for the glory of the king, and we turn that in so that others will just see our own glory and respond in praise. What was the connection with the sermon? The connection with the sermon was, no, you shouldn't just preach a lame sermon, whatever, because the whole point is to bring glory to the Creator, to give glory to the giver, to the glory to the Father. So yes, we should pursue excellence. Yes, we should pursue craftsmanship and all that, but where it gets twisted is when it's for our own glory instead of the glory of the giver. You see it? All right, have I beaten vainglory enough? You understand what it is? You see how it can be deadly or ruinous in terms of our relationship and what we're called to for the sake of the King? Maybe? Yeah, okay. So how are we going to treat this? In the time we have left, I just want to spend a little time in this opening scene in this second half of the book of John. There's probably a whole lot of better passages out there to, go out the business of practicing your righteousness before men and all that sort of stuff. But maybe it's just because it's the beginning of Holy Week that I wanted to really just kind of settle into this passage and let this passage just lead us into the week that's in front of us. So let me give a little bit of backdrop to John 13 and what we just read here. Okay, first of all, we're told now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come. Let me talk about that phrase, right? Remember, as we've been working through the book of John, you could actually argue that the book of John is structured along Jesus' encounters during the particular feast throughout the Jewish calendar. Pretty much every scene in the book of John has some relation or connection or association with a Jewish festival, feast, or whatever. And now we're coming to the pinnacle of the Jewish calendar. We're coming to the celebration of the Passover. People have been in Jerusalem now for the better part of a week, preparing, getting ready for this, right? And now we're coming to the center part of this whole week-long festival where families and friends and disciples are going to come together and they're going to celebrate the Passover feast, the meal. And as they're sitting around the table and they're enjoying the different elements of the meal and reading scriptures and praying together, they're remembering that climactic redemptive event of the whole Old Testament, when God had mercy on his people, when they were enslaved in Egypt, doing the bidding of the tyrannical Pharaoh, and God comes and he delivers them. Right? This was that feast, year in and year out, where you come back and you remember all that God had done. And so now Jesus is coming, and they're celebrating this Passover meal, but he's starting to tweak with it a little bit, which is something you didn't do back then. Man, people have been celebrating the Passover the same way for the past 1,500 years. And Jesus is coming in, and he's tweaking with little elements in the Passover meal, and he's kind of pointing these things to himself, and he's using this meal to say there's this another far more climactic redemptive event that's about to unfold, and it's essentially all about what I'm about to do on your behalf. Okay, so he's using this meal to try to sort of set up this climactic redemptive events that's about to take place in the days that follow. The other thing that's important here, this is like the second part of the book of John. You remember when we were working through John and we came to the end of 12, I said, actually, this is a great place to put it on pause and to go do the 7 deadly sins, right? Because we're coming to the end of book 1, essentially in the book of John, which would be the book of signs. It's been all these signs that Jesus has done in relation to the feast and then how that reveals who he is and whatnot. Okay, chapter 13 begins either the book of the hour or the book of glory, some people call it. Right? Jesus has been saying throughout the book up until this point, hey, my hour has not yet come. Right? And now, beginning in chapter 1, or in verse 1 of chapter 13, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come. And, think about the other times when Jesus says that phrase, it is not, the hour has not come for the Son of Man to be what? Glorified. Right? So that's why we might also call this the book of glory, because now is the hour when the Son of Man is going to be glorified. Okay, and I point that out. That's really important because this is the opening scene, or this is like the prelude scene that sets the whole stage for what's about to happen. In other words, this scene right here, this opening scene in John chapter 13, really sets the stage, really lays out right there what it means that the Son of Man is going to be glorified. All right, so I want to talk about this. I want to talk about, Jesus' glory as it's shown in this passage. I want to look at Peter's resistance and then just talk about what that means for us as we close it out. So here's the thing. This is the foot washing scene, obviously, and when we think about Jesus washing his feet, the disciples' feet, we have to do a little bit of work and put ourselves in an ancient mindset. That probably when we think of this business of Jesus washing his disciples' feet, our reaction to it is probably a little bit different than his disciples' reaction to it. Like we look at it and think, oh man, isn't that just a really nice act of service and love that he would get down and actually wash their feet? And it is that, but it's so much more than that. Maybe the other way to get at it this morning, if you've ever come to one of our Maundy Thursday services where we have the foot washing as part of it, or if your small group right now is doing a Maundy Thursday and is maybe bringing out some foot washing, right? You could ask the question this way: who's usually more embarrassed in that moment? The person washing the feet or the person getting their feet washed? I don't know what I'm hearing. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, based on the statistics of people who come to get their feet washed and don't, I think the more embarrassing part is those who are having to get their feet washed, right? We tend to think highly of the person who's willing to get down into the, and wash the feet. But man, for me to take my shoes off, the socks that I've been wearing all day, right? The feet might have a certain fragrant aroma to them. You might see, I don't know, that fungus that's been growing that you keep meaning to go to the doctor and get checked out, but you just haven't had time, or the stuff, whatever that, right? So whoa, this is a little embarrassing, right? The person getting their feet washed tends to be, in the modern culture, the more embarrassed person. Not so in the ancient culture. And to push that even further, you think your feet are in bad shape now. They were way worse shape back then, right? You didn't wear shoes back then. You walked around in sandals, and you weren't walking on nicely paved roads and sidewalks. You were walking on dirt roads that animals were traversing all the time, and you didn't have civil services that were coming out and cleaning up after the animals, right? You're just walking in that, and then you're coming to dinner, and somebody's going to wash your feet. And yet, it was far more humiliating and embarrassing in the ancient culture, the person who was washing the feet, than it was the person who was getting their feet washed. In the ancient culture, literally, foot washing was a very demeaning, degrading thing. So much so that even in the ancient culture, where it was so socially stratified, and you did have so many of the different social groups, it was unlawful to make a slave wash your feet, because it was so demeaning, so degrading, so below what you do. You were not allowed to force slaves even to wash your feet. Or we have Jewish rabbis on record saying, hey, don't have another Jewish person wash your feet. If you want to have a Gentile wash your feet, that's fine. Go ahead, get the Gentiles, they can wash your feet. But Jewish people, we do not wash other Jewish people's feet, and you don't ask another Jewish person to wash your feet. Right, so do you see it that actually what Jesus is doing here, he's taking the form of a less than slave as he gets up in the middle of dinner, takes off his outer garments, wraps them around his waist, and gets down on the ground and begins to wash his feet. This is not just a nice, quaint act of service and love and Jesus setting a good example. It is that, but it's so much more than that. It's Jesus literally humiliating himself in every sense of the term in that ancient culture, in the Jewish culture of the people that are in that room. He's humiliating himself. He's taking the form of a less than slave. Very significant. So then here comes Peter. Peter, asks the question, Lord, you're going to wash my feet? And Jesus says, Peter, you don't understand what I'm doing. You will. Give it 3 days. And you'll see me doing far worse. You'll see me eventually hanging on a cross. You'll see me coming out victorious at the other end, right? And then you'll remember, oh, yeah, that was the prelude. That was setting it all up. That was preparing me for what was yet to come. But at this point, he doesn't understand. So Peter says, Lord, you are going to wash my feet? No, Jesus, you will never wash my feet, says Peter. And so here's the question, what is behind that firm resistance of Peter? It could be that Peter is embarrassed about his feet, right? Maybe he's, walked around and, he's gotten all sorts of dirt and animal stuff on his feet, whatever. Just don't touch the feet. Let me clean them up first. And then that could be. Chances are probably not. Could be that Peter is embarrassed for Jesus. Jesus, come on, you're Lord, you're master here. What are you doing, debasing yourself? Do you not know Jewish customs? Let me inform you, educate you here. You don't do this. Could be. And there's probably a decent part of that in there. I actually think it goes a little bit beyond that, though. I think at least part of the resistance of Peter is actually what it means for him now as a follower of Jesus. Right? Because Peter calls this guy Lord, calls this guy Master. Peter is the one who will follow him with his life. And Jesus, I'll be there with you. I'll follow you to the very end. I'm with you. I'll follow you. I honor you in all this. So if the Master is getting down and washing the feet, if the Master is humiliating himself and getting on the ground and washing the feet, what does that mean for the followers? Right? You see the problem here? Actually, if you read Luke's account of this, well, let me say this. I think that's part of the issue, because stay in John with me for a second, and we'll go back to Luke. Notice how Jesus continues. He says to them, do you understand what I've done to you? Right? It's not just about cleaning off the dirt off your feet. It's not just an act of love. Do you understand what I have done to you here? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. And if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. You also ought to take the form of a less than slave and even be willing to do the socially humiliating stuff of wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you also should do just as I've done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Blessed are you if you follow my example. Or now consider the Luke passage. Because when Luke tells the story of this Last Supper, do you remember what's some of the conversation that's happening among the disciples as they're around the table? Who's the greatest? Yeah, right? They're wrestling. They're going into the supper with that old Roman notion of glory and greatness. And so Jesus has to come in. A dispute also arose about them. This is Luke 22, as to which of them was regarded as the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table, according to Roman protocol? But I am among you as one who serves. Right? Flipping that whole Roman social protocol, social order on its head. Right? If we had chance, we could read in Matthew where even as you back it up a couple more days, and as they're about to come into Jerusalem, you've got the Zebedee brothers, James and John. Actually, her mother is coming to Jesus and say, hey, when you come into the kingdom, can you grant that my two boys will sit on your right and your left? And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking for. Why? Because you're living out of that old Roman social imaginary. I'm flipping all of that on his head. You don't understand. You know, and then you begin to see this same, pattern coming out then right as you come into the rest of the New Testament. You got guys like Paul, when he writes to the church in Philippi, that among other things is maybe struggling with division and dissension, and some people thinking of themselves more important than the others, or their needs, being neglected. Paul's going to write to them in chapter 2, and he's going to say those famous lines, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also the interest of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a doulos in the Greek, which in its least offensiveness means servant, and its most offensiveness, at least to our ears, means slave. Right? Which is the wildness of this whole story, is it not? Right? That the eternal Creator God, the second person of the Trinity, through whom all things have been made, the one who fashioned life, the King of Kings, would leave the glory of heaven and enter into a broken, twisted, and rebellious creation and take on the form not of royalty, but of a first century Middle Eastern peasant. And then not only that, but actually go through life bearing the brunt of that brokenness, being betrayed, being denied, being slandered, right? Till ultimately he's being spit upon, thorns twisted into his head, spear thrust into his side, nails into his hands. So what? So that he may be the slave to your ultimate needs, so that he may tend to the things that are keeping you from the life that the Father would have for you to the very end. He would love you to the very end. Right? So, yeah, Jesus here in this Last Supper takes the form of a less than slave. shows us what glory is. Do you see it? And so then now what is he doing? He's calling his disciples to follow his example, right? He's calling his disciples, don't let the love of glory, here's where we would connect it to vainglory, don't let the love of earthly glory get in the way of my calling upon you to love and to attend to and service the needs of your brothers and sisters, the needs of your neighbor, the needs of your family, the needs of those that I am calling you in mission to serve. Right, which maybe gets us to Peter's resistance, right? The danger of Peter's resistance is twofold. One, that he might miss the glory. We'll get to that in a second. But the other one, we could say, is that he might miss the grace of it. Right? Peter said, hey, you don't wash my feet. And Jesus says, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. Peter gets that, and he says, okay, well then wash the whole thing, because I don't want to miss out on that. And Jesus, a complicated conversation, but I think he's just simply pointing to all that's yet to come. Unless you receive these acts of love and service that I'm doing for you, this is the only way you can have any part of me in my kingdom, right? But Peter, in his resistance, Peter in his pride or in his resistance to having to follow suit, don't wash my feet, he stands in danger of missing the grace of God. And maybe I could put that, we bring it back into our context. Again, it certainly would seem the case that when we have those Monday, Thursday services that, I think I'll refrain from the whole foot washing thing, taking my socks off and my shoes in I'd rather, I don't know what's going through the mind, but maybe it says, I would rather people think that I have lovely, very fragrant feet and not expose it and remove all manner of doubt that I do not. Okay, that's fine. Maybe. The bigger problem, though, is my guess is, if you're not willing to take the socks and the shoes off to expose that to others, are you willing to expose the far dirtier stuff, the sinful struggles, the areas where you have yielded to temptation this past week, the ways that you have been a brute and a tyrant in the home and you have just plowed over the people in your care, in home, at the workplace, or whatever? Like, are you willing to open up that dirtiness so that you may receive the prayer and the love and the accountability and the support of your brothers and sisters? I would be worried. If you're concerned what people think about your feet, you're all the more concerned about what people think about your heart. So watch out. That vainglory can lead you from receiving the grace that Christ would have for you. But again, the bigger thing is that you would stand to miss the glory. Peter, in his refusal to have to be like Christ and take the form of a less than slave, stands to miss out on the glory. Or here's to get us back to that original question. He stands to miss out on the good life. See, because according to Christ, the gospel writers, the New Testament, this is the good life. Not only that you would be brought into this kingdom, but that you would follow in the pathway of the King. The good life, and this is what we always have to constantly preach to ourselves, is not this life in unabandoned pursuit of the self and desires and goals and ambitions. It's picking up your cross, denying yourself, and following the King. That's always the good life. Right? In a world where everybody and social media is just feeding into this vainglorious lifestyle, we constantly need to be preached at that, no, the good life is following the King, being willing to take the form of a less than slave so that you may participate in the grace of God, the redeeming acts of God for those he loves. Oh, we could keep going, but I want to just wrap it up with, how do we do that? Again, not just tell you these sins and tell you to stop it, or just do this or whatever. But I think it's very significant in the very beginning of that, where in verse 3, where it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. Right? Why does John tell us that? See, because I think that's what's empowering him. Jesus knows who he is. He knows who the Father says that he is. He knows all that the Father has given to him. He knows he comes from the Father, he's going back to the Father, and it's out of that confidence and out of that freedom that he has no problem taking the form of a less than slave. I often tend to think that what lies behind, vainglory in our modern culture is just this deep, deep and growing insecurity, where we don't know who we are anymore as a culture. We've cut all the ties with the things that in generations past used to define us, right? Whether ties of the neighborhood or the community or religion, or whatever, and we've just collapsed everything in on the self. And as a result of that, we're still just struggling to try to find out who we are anymore. And in a culture that prizes this idea of you have to know who you are and live your true self, and you do you, be you, man, there is this deep insecurity that seems to be growing ever more. And out of that insecurity, it's going to be really hard to kick the habit of vainglory, or the sin of vainglory, I should say. If you're going to walk in a rejection of vainglory, being willing to humble and even humiliate yourself for the needs of another, man, you have to know who you are in the Father's eyes. Right? You have to know that what Jesus is doing when he steps on that cross it's the great transfer. Right? Your sins and your ugliness and brokenness and unworthiness is being placed on him, and his glory and his righteousness and his perfect standing before the Father is being placed on you, so that now when the Father looks at you, he sees the glory of the Son. Now when the Father loves the Son or looks to you and how he's going to treat you, it's with the love that he has for his dearly loved Son, right? And so you need to see that, you need to hear that, and embrace that. Ancient spiritual writers would say that one of the great spiritual disciplines to wage war against vainglory is actually solitude. Get away from the crowd. Get away from the audience. Shut all that off. Leave the phone at home and just sit and quiet in the solitude and prayerfully listen to the voice of the Spirit through the Word that would dare to tell you who you are in Christ. All that is yours in Christ, all that has been given to you by the Father, all that is yet to come by the gracious hand of the Father. And as that sinks in and that becomes more your true identity and how you understand yourself, then as you move back into the crowd and the audience, you might find yourself a little bit more free of their gaze and their approval, such that you could even become a servant or a slave to them, should Christ call you to that. There's one more thing I wanted to say before we close it out. I would just say this. In that solitude, hear the voice of the Spirit and the Word that defines you, and then see the beauty of the kingdom. Right? See the beauty of Christ's kingdom over against the kingdoms of the world that we play into. Man, I'm really going over time this morning. Sorry. If you ask me, this is going to be the sin that future generations are going to struggle with the most. And so we're going to need those spiritual disciplines of solitude, pressing into the grace, the love, the identity that the Father gives to us, and then, seeing the beauty and the glory of the kingdom, so that more and more we, not just in word or in the mind, think that, that's the good life, the kingdom of Christ, but we really see, no, that is glory. That what John is showing us here as we flip the page into the book of glory, that more and more, that is becoming my worldview. That is becoming my life view. That is becoming my definition of the good life. That I would follow my King wherever he goes, however he goes. We'll leave it at that. Continue the conversation. Take some time. Delight in all that the Father says that you are through Christ because of what he's done for you. Maybe this week, just soak in the radical, counterintuitive nature of the glory of Christ that's on display and all that means for you. Soak that in. See the glory of the kingdom as Christ comes, I like to think of him barreling out of that tomb, thumping that tomb and sticking it to death, right? And this kingdom now that is being unleashed, see that as the glorious stuff, such that you not only want to be in it, but be a part of the mission of that. And as you do, you might find the Spirit leading you into the freedom of sons and daughters, free from the vainglorious pursuits of the admiration of others, so that you can live into the truly good and rich life that Jesus is inviting you to. And may he lead you in that. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.